Yeah, I started to branch out in the sorts of things I did, working on environmental impact assessment. In the early 90s, the proposal for the Great Whale Project came up. And that looked like a particularly foolish proposal because it involved changing the courses of a number of rivers and putting a new outlet to the Great Whale River opposite an island, and we really didn't know what the impact of fresh water in a otherwise salt water. And it turns out now, I'm hearing from people that the salinity issue is becoming really critical in environmental impacts of the whole James Bay project, putting in fresh water at times of the year when it's not natural, during the winter time when normally the drainage system shuts down and very little drainage takes place when everything is frozen. Now with hydroelectric schemes, fresh water is being released into saltwater environments and at different times of the year. And we're looking at this in Labrador right now with regard to the potential impact of the Muskrat Falls project on Lake Melville, which is a saltwater inlet. So, you know, being a social scientist, I have to try to keep up with the hard sciences in what current knowledge is about things like that. I don't come to that knowledge independently. Same as my knowledge of history. I mean, I learn history by having to delve into fur trade documents, and over the years, I've acquired an understanding of Canadian history that I never studied at either high school or university level. But I think it's very important to know your history in order to understand the present, why things are the way they are. But I'm pretty well self-taught. But the same, as I say, in the hard sciences, in chemistry and in environmental sciences, to do the kind of work I do where you're studying Indigenous knowledge, and they have very detailed knowledge, but it may not be expressed or categorized in the same way as scientific knowledge about the same phenomenon. That's another of my interests, is trying to understand Indigenous knowledge and the way it can be used in modern contexts. Part of the problem is Indigenous people are generally oral societies, and that this kind of knowledge is shared with children, young adults, as they grow in capacity to learn. They are told these things, and they learn through that oral teaching. But it's not just oral teaching; it's teaching in the context of an actual physical engagement with the environment. In other words, it's part of a piece of work people are doing, either work related to hunting, work related to gathering of plants, healing plants, whatever. There's Indigenous knowledge is different from scientific knowledge in the sense that it's both communicated and acquired and developed in a particular context. You take it out of that context and put it in a book and expect it to do the same job. of convincing a court, for example, that Indigenous interest it isn't as effective. And I've often I've written about this. I'm not sure what can be done about it, but we need to be aware of Indigenous knowledge in its home context, where it's shared, in order to do the difficult translation job of putting it into the context where other knowledges are put up against it, scientific knowledge and that sort of thing. So it's there is a current acceptance of Indigenous knowledge, but I'm concerned that there is little understanding of the complexities of how to put it up against scientific knowledge and give it its proper place. But yes, what else were we talking about? While I was a young anthropologist, certainly I got involved in some of the professional organizations. Went to you give papers at meetings and join organizations. I've always been a great friend of sociology. In some cases, some anthropologists have a hostility to sociology. And so I wasn't that unhappy with the fact that we were, when I first got involved as a professional, we were part of the Sociology Anthropology organization. We had there were various discussions about founding a distinct Canadian anthropology group. Partly, I think it was concerned that a lot of Canadian anthropologists finding themselves going off to the United States to conferences, giving presentations, even looking for jobs in the United States. And a lot of Americans, on the other hand, at that time, a number had been hired in Canadian universities. So there was an unhappiness among some anthropologists about that situation. CASCA, the Canadian Anthropology Society, and I got involved in the early years just as a member at large for go to meetings and be concerned with the political issues that the profession had to deal with at that time. Temperamentally, I'm not that much of an organizational person and bureaucratically minded or that sort of thing. So I haven't been a strong, lifelong, I don't go to meetings every year or anything, but I've certainly given enough of my papers. I guess the other thing about my work, you'll find that most of my publications are in books, in collected books, where I write a chapter on a topic of which the book is all about that topic. And often they came as a result of a conference where there was a session. And if you like, I'm a lazy publisher. I don't run after prestigious journals and try and do a lot of work to get my work put in the most prestigious places. But it's worked out well for me, or at least it suits my way of working. Apart from Memorial, I was very fortunate in 2000 to get an invited visiting professorship at Dartmouth College in the United States, which really, the students there were such a pleasure to teach. They were so well prepared, and that compared to my experience in Newfoundland, as much as I love Newfoundland and Memorial University, but meeting other scholars. And at that time, we were putting together a book that was actually come largely out of Dartmouth on the Great Whale Project. And it seemed to me that while certainly Hydro-Quebec and the Quebec government thought that this was just a knee-jerk reaction of Indigenous people who really didn't know anything about hydroelectricity or anything, just opposing it either because they just didn't like it or because they wanted to use it as a strategy to gain more power in negotiations with government. But looking at the project, I was convinced with the Cree that it was a very bad idea. A lot of unknowns in regard to environmental effects. And we're finding the unknown, we're now finding that the project itself, the Laugrand, the main hydroelectric project, and that not only with mercury, but various other unforeseen eventualities. It turns out that Quebec, by canceling the project, did itself a great favor because they are now saddled with these northern projects that have to be paid off, but they can't sell the electricity at the kinds of prices they were anticipating when they were born because of the, it may not last forever, but you can generate electricity in the United States with natural gas for far less than you can produce it in northern Quebec and ship it to the States. So one never knows where one's research is going to take you. And among the Cree, there is always this tension between once they got moved off the trap lines and into communities, the need for money, money for food, money for all kinds of other things, and all the glorious toys of four-wheel drive trucks and that, it's just endless, the amount of household budgets that can be consumed by the consumer society. So the Crees have opted in to that thing, and so they have to have a continual. So they are on a path towards what the McGill Cree project may have correctly foreseen, that eventually they are, to greater or lesser degree, having to become workers in the industrial society. But at least they're doing it under their own terms. It's their own decision now. It is a crisis within the communities how to maintain their traditions, which include hunting and all of that, at the same time as getting a reasonable amount of money for their needs. So, I'm continually interested in that kind of thing. As far as the work in Fiji goes, I've gone back several times. The first two times I went with my whole family, so it was very interesting living in a small village in the highlands, in the mountain areas of the largest island of Viti Levu. The kids were made such a fun. It was such an easy piece of field work to do. The Fijians are amazing hosts. And I found myself, even though, it was an accidental piece of research. I thought I was going to Vanuatu, end up having to, at the last minute, put together a project and I just picked the place where there was least literature in Fiji about. I didn't have much background in Fijian academic literature on Fiji, but we found this area and found people who would support us and that. So we had an amazing year there in '86. Then leaving the country, almost as soon as I left, a coup broke out in which a military people took over the government. That's only the first of about 3 military coups that have taken place in Fiji since I've been doing research there. You know, it's a complex situation in that the native Fijians are almost outnumbered by immigrants who were brought in by the British in the early 20th century to work on the plantations, because the indigenous people, I would argue, were quite satisfied with their own self-sustaining economy. They could grow their food and that. They didn't see any attraction to working on a plantation. So they had to, first they tried what they called blackbirding, basically kidnapping people and bringing them to work on things. That was outlawed by the British. And so the British brought in indentured laborers, people who'd signed up for so many years of work from the poorest areas of India, where the British were having their own problems with these. And once they'd done their indenture, they didn't want to return, and quite naturally. So now, by the time of these military coups, which were often fueled by hatred between Fijians and Indo-Fijians, or hatred, misunderstanding, dislike, mistrust, even though the Fijians, under the constitution that was left to them by the British, really had their rights fairly carefully protected, so that a lot of the reasons given for the coup made absolutely no sense. Sorry. I will off-call it later. Finally, now Fiji. I'm looking forward to another trip, because to finish up, the study I did was a regional study, unlike a single community or village. It was an unusual area of Fiji in that while the Fijians as a whole had willingly offered themselves to the British to become part of the British Empire, mainly because of one of the chiefs had got himself in debt to an American and needed the British to help him pay off the debt. And these were some of the most powerful tribal groups in Fiji who sided with the British and who had become converted to Christianity by then. Up in the hills where my people were, they had no such news of this, and they didn't want to, they didn't like the ideas that they were being given over to the British. And so they fought the coastal people as well as, and then the British sent in the troops. And so there was what's called the Little War, a small war where these people were pacified. Now they consisted of, must be 20 different villages in the interior. They were punished rather severely, many of them exiled to other parts of Fiji, or the ringleaders were shot. And yet, by the time I go there, this is back in the 1870s, 1880s, when these events were taking place, they were brought back into Fijian national thing. slowly they were first treated much more treated harshly in contrast to the relatively privileged life that the Fijians, as an example of British colonial rule, Fiji wasn't that bad. People, particularly for the indigenous Fijians, and there is still very fond memories of the British by the Fijians. But this group that was the object of my study would have been an exception. However, nobody talks about this. It's sort of a suppressed memory. The fighting took place. They were cannibals at the time, and there are some pretty horrendous stories, including one of a missionary who was killed and eaten near where my village I happened to be living, and stories about his various body parts being shared among the local villages and that sort of thing. So it's amazing how hospitable and friendly and comfortable and safe with our children we felt. There was they don't have malaria there, they don't have any of the infectious diseases. It was just, compared to Vanuatu, where I was planning to go, where there's all kinds of diseases it was actually a fortunate accident that I didn't go to Vanuatu, but went to Fiji instead. It opened up my mind to the realities of colonial rule, in the sense that although it was no longer a colony, a lot of the British legacy to the Fijians has been taken up by the Fijian government. And so it's almost as if you're living in a colonial rule with much of the structures. You have a Department of Fijian Affairs that looks after traditional Fijian life, just like Indian affairs. I mean, it was it's still a somewhat colonial relationship between the bureaucrats in Suva and the people and in fact, the bureaucracy is dominated by certain tribal groups, particularly from the outlying islands of Fiji, who had made greater contact with Tonga and other islands, and are considered more sophisticated. And so there's an internal colonial or class, ethnic, colonial type of situation. So I found Fiji extremely interesting place, although not always easy. Easy place to work, but very pleasant. So, in between, spending time in Canada, where I mainly work on Indigenous stuff. The other thing I should have seen it coming. At age 65, I was forcefully retired. That was the rule at the time. Everybody, and it ended a year or two later. But what it's meant is, and I'm not at all unhappy to be retired. Teaching would tie me down, and so I'm much freer to travel, and I have a pension, so I can. But I still think of myself as an academic. I don't really have another major life enterprise to fall back on, and so I've continued to do research, write papers, go to conferences whenever I can. You don't get that much support when you're retired, but that has certainly shaped my life in the last 15 years. It was 2002 I was retired, so I've been retired for quite a while now, but I like doing anthropology. I'm still active enough to be able to do field work, and so it's a pleasure to do it, and I've got plenty of material. Once once my doctors tell me I can't travel as much, I've still got plenty to do in terms of writing based on my existing research. Yeah, I'm looking at some of these questions here. Yeah, out of my concern with the mistreatment of Indigenous people in Newfoundland in particular, I mean, I'm not particularly a fan of Indian Affairs and their way they have administered Native people. But when you see when I saw in 1972 the conditions that Aboriginal people in that province faced, where they had essentially no recognition and very minimal social supports from government, it was clear to me that recognition by the federal government, as they should have done in 1949, was a worthwhile objective. And both the Inuit and the Cree and the Mi'kmaq, and later on the Innu, all have gotten on board that, have now received full federal recognition and are signing land claims. The Inuit have a very interesting land claim, that having been involved in the James Bay Agreement, which was really the first modern land claim, one is interested to see what similarities other groups managed to negotiate for themselves and what things they haven't done. So, and as a teacher, I had to keep up with what's going on in the Aboriginal, so I remained very much a generalist because that's what I would be teaching while I was still professor at the university. And, I probably already said the James Bay Project, the James Bay Agreement, let me correct that, as the first modern land claim, gave such advantages that while, along with most other people, I objected to the insistence of the federal government that the first clause be extinguishment, where the agreement is that all rights, title, and that are surrendered forever in exchange for. But I was able to convince myself this is Aboriginal rights. We're simply taking a vague and unknown right and converting it into specific rights that you can take to the bank, as it were. Anyway, so I've been, a proponent, even though certainly at the time I was negotiating on behalf of the Naskapi. George Manuel, who I admired very much as the leader of the Assembly of First Nations at that time, I think it was called that, or National Indian Brotherhood, he was dead set opposed to land claims and tried to convince the Naskapi that I was negotiating with to get out. But my opinion is that while land claims are not a full recognition of the Indigenous, of the fact that they were landowners at the time that Europeans arrived and should have that acknowledged, and not just landowners, they were self-governing, and those two facts are important. But anyway, for all their lack of full recognition of those rights, land claims are better than nothing.